This is an article based on the lecture delivered by Professor Tracy K Smith, the Poet Laureate of the US, from 2017 to 2019. The lecture was delivered at the Library of Congress in Washington in April 2018. Down the bottom's a link so that you can actually listen to it if you like. So the following article is extracts from that lecture, so it's not the complete lecture but relevant extracts. Smith says, I wanted to talk about why poetry feels so important to me now, and a little bit about, what makes this sense of mission into other parts of the US in my role of Poet Laureate. Poetry is not the language we live in. It's not the language of our day-to-day errand running and obligation fulfilling, not the language with which we're asked to justify ourselves to the outside world. It certainly isn't the language to which commercial value has been assigned. But poetry, which awakens our senses, frees us from the tyranny of literal meaning and assures the credible reality of emotional truth, puts us in touch with something bigger than language, something I believe each of us was perhaps fluent in before the moment when language became our chief vehicle for meaning. So that reminds us of Derrida, of course. Before I go any further, let me say that this lecture, like the poetry I write, is the product of a particular imagination, one as informed by belief in a vast and mysterious, yet orderly and purposeful universe, as by a deep curiosity about the voices and lives of strangers. Furthermore, I'm operating on the notion that poetry can save me from disappearing into a narrow version of myself. I may be tempted to resort to when I feel lazy or defeated, or when my greedy ego takes over. I'm operating on the belief that poetry can restore me to the large original self I haven't yet fully learned to recognize. Poets have different names for that self. Stanley Kunitz called it a pool of energy that has nothing to do with personal identity, but falls away from self, blends into the natural universe. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. Emerson believed it lived in the same place the inner voice does. So this is poetic language, and that it had access to the large whole of what each of us are but small parts. What he called the oversoul, the silence, the universal beauty. So each of those poets, as well as Smith, posits that poetry takes us beyond ourselves. Poetry takes us beyond our day-to-day experiences. Poetry helps us to experience a collective experience of being human that's beyond the boundaries of our day-to-day lives. Poetry helps us to explore notions that might be spiritual or metaphysical. Poetry takes us beyond the boundaries of self. Smith says, one of poetry's great effects through its emphasis upon feeling, association, music, and image, things we recognize and respond to even before we understand why, is to guide us towards the part of ourselves so deeply buried that it borders on the collective. Now, I feel strongly about poetry for what it offers in these terms, but I also more and more recognize its value as a remedy, a kind of a medicine to the various things that have bombarded our lines of sight and our thought space, and that tamper with our ability, or even our desire, to listen to that deeply rooted part of ourselves. So when we read that, we think about our Reimagined Worlds and our Literary Worlds rubric, our syllabus documents. But it also makes me think personally of a Text and Human Experience syllabus document. That literature looks at the lives of ourselves and other people and our collective identity. So this is something that Smith is very conscious of when she's creating her poetry. I'll return to her words. Well, as a writer, I'm convinced that one of the only defences against the degradations of our market-driven culture is to cleave or to connect to language that fosters humility, awareness of complexity, commitment to the lives of others, and a resistance to the overly easy and the patently false. Poetry is one vehicle for this humanising, reanimating version of language, because the features of a poem insist upon a different value system. Rather than numbing or drowning out the difficult to describe but urgently sense feelings that are a part of being human, poetry invites us to tease them out, to draw them into language that is rooted in intricate thought and strange impulse. Rather than putting up a buffer between ourselves and those outside our immediate sphere, poems devise means to contemplate those others and to take in their perspectives. Again, that reminds me of the syllabi for text and human experience, and both syllabi for extension. Back to Smith. Rather than solving, sidestepping, or denying problems, poems bear witness to dark facets of experience. In other words, poems say, "Here, come here. Let me tell you what it was like." And poems ask us to submit to another experience of reality. So this idea of submitting or willingly partaking in the mystery of the poems makes me think of Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief that we studied in Year 11. So in order to fully enjoy literature in whatever form, we are willing members. We willingly suspend disbelief. We choose to believe the reality. And so Smith is positing the same idea here. We submit to another experience of reality. Back to Smith. Poems disoriented us from our home base. They teach us to admit and submit to the feeling of vulnerability, to act upon empathy and curiosity, to follow along, allowing sense to accrue at its own pace and upon its own terms. If you do that enough times with a poem, you might begin to think differently about actual strangers. You might begin to recognise that there are new possibilities of feeling and awareness available to you. Ones that take you far beyond those pitched to you by the marketing teams and corporations whose products are, at the moment, enjoying a good run. Smith says, in case I haven't said it clearly, the language circulating upon the surface of the 21st century is in the business of pulling us away from the interior, the reflective, the singular, the impractical, and the unsummarizable. In such a current, the language of poetry is a radically rehumanizing force. I'll read that again. The language of poetry is a radically rehumanizing force. Why? Because it's one of the only generally accessible languages that rewards us for naming things in their realness and their complexity. And despite what social media would have us believe, poetic language is not the language of sharing and following or buying or wearing. And in Year 11 we looked at Shoshana Zuboff's theories about the marketization or the commodification of life. She said, no longer do we say I think therefore I am, but we say I buy and I do, therefore I am. And that modern societies define themselves by how they present themselves to the wider world. It's not about thinking about, it's about doing and having. And of course Instagram and Snapchat are obvious examples of that. Smith says poetic language is that of bearing deep and unabashed, so that means unashamed, witness to the urgencies and the upheavals of lived experience that comes closest to bringing us into visceral proximity with the lives and the plights of others. That's not just distraction. That's not a luxury. It's a means of self-preservation, a way of affirming commitment to the belief that our lives can and should matter to one another and to ourselves. So through this, Smith says that poetry is the language of our humanity. A poem says, no, you have feelings, you have fears, you have questions. Let's go back to the voice and the vocabulary of being human. And that, my friends, is why we study